Ring camera video from a Catalina foothills home just blocks away from Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood making the rounds online tonight. And it was taken just last night, showing a masked person in gloves walking up a private driveway.
84 years old, a quiet home in one of Tucson's most peaceful neighborhoods. A woman who had lived a full life, raised remarkable children, and by every measure had earned the right to feel safe inside her own walls. And then, she was gone. Not gradually, not with warning, gone in the way that leaves a family standing in an empty room, staring at the space where someone they love used to be, unable to explain what the air itself seems to be hiding. Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson, Arizona. And from the moment law enforcement began working this case, two things became clear very quickly. First, this was not a random disappearance. Second, the answers were buried far deeper than anyone initially understood. For weeks, the public followed every development, every press conference, every search update. The Pima County Sheriff's Department worked alongside the FBI, and eventually, after 79 days of investigation, a name emerged. A suspect was identified, search warrants were executed, a vehicle was seized, evidence was collected. The public exhaled, just slightly, believing the case was finally moving toward resolution. That exhale was premature, because here is what nobody saw coming. In the days that followed that initial breakthrough,
the FBI and local deputies executed coordinated warrants at a house near Nancy's residence.
As investigators continued pulling threads from every corner of this case, a new name surfaced. Not from a tip line, not from a press release, from deep inside the investigation itself. From the kind of intelligence that law enforcement does not discuss publicly until they are absolutely certain of what they are looking at. That name is Tommaso, and the moment it surfaced, everything changed. Because understanding how this story reached people matters. It tells us something about how information in this case has been controlled, shaped, and in some instances, deliberately delayed. Nancy Guthrie is not simply an elderly woman from Tucson. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognized faces in American morning television, co-host of NBC's Today Show. The moment Nancy disappeared, this case carried a weight that most missing persons investigations never receive. National media attention, federal involvement, resources that smaller cases never see. And still, for 79 days, there were no answers. Think about that number, 79 days. That is not an investigation that moved slowly because of a lack of information. That is an investigation that was deliberately careful, deliberately methodical, because the people behind this.
Monica, that's right. If this were any other situation, this video likely would not be getting this sort of attention, but it's not a different scenario.
Whoever they are, covered their tracks with a precision that suggested planning. Real planning, the kind that does not happen impulsively. The Catalina foothills is a specific kind of neighborhood, elevated, private. The kind of area where homes are spaced apart, where neighbors do not necessarily know each other's routines, and where someone moving through in the early hours would not automatically draw attention. Investigators understood from early on that whoever took Nancy Guthrie knew this. They understood the geography. They understood the window of opportunity. That knowledge, that specific, local, geographic knowledge, became one of the most important threads in the entire investigation. And Tommaso's connection to that thread is precisely why law enforcement is now looking at him with the full weight of this case behind their eyes. He did not appear in the early reports. His name did not surface during the initial 79 days when the public was watching every update. There is a reason for that. Investigators hold names back when they are still building, when the evidence is accumulating but not yet complete, when releasing a name too early could compromise what they are quietly assembling behind closed doors. That moment has now passed.
It is someone walking on your property late at night, uninvited, committing, it might be a small crime, but committing a crime, and it is disturbing. It drives the point home that we have to be watchful, be aware of our homes, but also of our neighbors.
The link between Tommaso and Nancy Guthrie's disappearance did not come from speculation. It did not come from social media theories or amateur investigators working from publicly available information. It came from inside the case, from the forensic and intelligence work that has been running parallel to everything the public has been allowed to see. And what it reveals is this. The investigation that the public believed was narrowing toward one conclusion has just cracked open in a direction nobody anticipated. This is what happens in cases built on layers. The first layer, the one visible to cameras and press conferences, tells one story. The layer beneath it, the one built from evidence rather than optics, tells another. And the layer beneath that one? That is where the truth lives. That is where investigators have been working. Quietly, relentlessly, without announcement. Tommaso's emergence is a signal from that deepest layer. It means the people working this case know something they have not yet shared. It means the public narrative, the one that felt like it was approaching resolution, was only ever a partial picture. And it means that for Nancy Guthrie's family, who have lived through 79 days of uncertainty already, the case they believed was moving in one direction is now moving in another.
It's only about 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's own home. They were also taking a pretty close look at a Range Rover that was parked at a Culver's just a couple of miles away from here as well.
More complex, more calculated, and far more personal than anyone outside this investigation had any reason to suspect. There is a detail about this case that most people overlooked entirely, not because it was hidden, but because it did not seem significant at the time. In investigations like this one, the details that seem insignificant in week 1 become the most critical pieces by week 12. Law enforcement knows this. They are trained to hold certain observations in reserve, to wait until the larger picture emerges before assigning weight to what initially appears minor. One of those details, one that was documented early and quietly set aside, now connects directly to Tommaso. That connection is not circumstantial. That is what makes this development different from the noise that surrounds any high-profile missing persons investigation. In cases like this, theories multiply constantly. Names get attached to speculation. The internet generates its own parallel investigations that rarely intersect with what is actually happening inside law enforcement. This is not that. This is different in kind and in weight. Investigators do not surface a name from inside a live federal investigation without evidence behind it. That is not how this works. That is not how the Pima County Sheriff's Department operates, and it is certainly not how the FBI approaches a case of this visibility and sensitivity. When Tommaso's name moved from the internal investigation file into the circle of active focus, that was not an accident. That was the result of months of forensic work, digital analysis, geographic mapping, and intelligence gathering finally converging on a point that could no longer be ignored. And here is what that convergence tells us. Nancy Guthrie did not disappear because of bad luck. She did not disappear because of a random encounter with someone passing through the Catalina foothills on the wrong night. This disappearance had architecture. It had timing. It had knowledge behind it that could only exist if someone had spent time, real, deliberate time, understanding her world before they moved against it. That is the kind of planning that leaves traces. And those traces, quietly collected, carefully preserved, are what led investigators to the name that nobody in the public conversation had spoken until now. Tommaso. The investigation everyone thought they understood just became something else entirely. And before this story is over, the depth of what law enforcement is now looking at will make the first 79 days feel like the opening chapter of something far darker, and far more deliberate, than a disappearance. Nancy Guthrie is still gone. But for the first time in this case, the people who know exactly what happened to her may be facing something they did not plan for. The truth has a way of surfacing. And right now, it is rising. Not expands, not shifts slightly, changes, completely and without warning. The way a room changes when someone turns on a light that was never supposed to be found. That moment arrived in the Nancy Guthrie case the day Tommaso's name entered the active investigation file. And to understand why that moment matters, it is necessary to understand something about how law enforcement builds a case like this one. In the early weeks of a disappearance investigation, investigators cast wide. They collect names, movements, connections, digital footprints, and behavioral patterns from a large pool of individuals who existed anywhere near the edges of the victim's world. Most names in that pool get eliminated quickly. They have alibis. Their digital records place them elsewhere. Their behavior in the days surrounding the disappearance shows nothing that flags concern. Most names disappear from the file. Some do not. Tommaso's name did not disappear. It stayed. And over time, as the investigation deepened and the forensic picture grew more detailed, the reasons it stayed became more specific. More concrete. More difficult to explain away. The Catalina foothills area of Tucson is not a neighborhood that strangers pass through casually. The geography works against that. The roads into that elevated residential stretch are specific, intentional. If someone was moving through that area in the time frame surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, they were there with a destination in mind. They knew where they were going. They had been there before, or they had studied it well enough to move through it with the confidence of someone familiar. That level of familiarity does not happen overnight, and Tommaso's connection to this geographic zone is one of the first things that pulled his name out of the wide pool and into a much narrower circle of focus. His proximity to the Catalina foothills was not incidental. It was documented, verifiable, the kind of geographic connection that, on its own, might mean nothing, but layered against everything else investigators were assembling, began to form a pattern that was impossible to dismiss. Here is something that rarely gets discussed in public coverage of cases like this one. When investigators profile a suspect in a disappearance that shows signs of planning, they do not just look at where someone was. They look at the window of time before the disappearance, the weeks and months leading up to the event, because planned actions leave behavioral traces long before the action itself occurs. Changes in routine, changes in communication patterns, movements that, in isolation, look unremarkable, but when placed on a timeline against the disappearance, begin to tell a very different story. That behavioral timeline, when applied to Tommaso, produced findings that investigators have not yet made public. But the existence of those findings is precisely why his name has not been dismissed. Consider what it means for a name to remain active in a federal investigation of this scale. The FBI does not sustain interest in individuals without evidence. The Pima County Sheriff's Department does not coordinate with federal resources around a name that is merely theoretical. The fact that Tommaso's name has moved from background context into active investigative focus means that something specific, something documented, something that exists in evidence and not in speculation, placed him there. That something is now being examined with the full weight of federal forensic resources behind it. His profile, when studied through the lens of this case, raises questions that do not resolve easily. His connection to the Catalina foothills area is geographic. His connection to the timeline of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance is behavioral. And his connection to certain individuals who existed on the edges of the original investigation, individuals whose names appeared briefly in early reports and then faded from public view, is the thread that may ultimately prove most significant. Because this case was never about one person working alone. That conclusion emerged early. The forensic evidence made it clear. But the question that investigators have been working to answer ever since is not simply how many people were involved. It is how those people connected to each other. What was the architecture of the relationship between them? And who, at the center of that architecture, had both the knowledge and the access to make this disappearance possible? Tommaso's emergence as a figure of active investigative interest suggests that the architecture is becoming clearer. Think about what 79 days of investigation actually looks like from the inside. It is not press conferences and search parties. It is forensic analysts running evidence through databases. It is digital investigators pulling records from platforms and servers. It is field agents conducting interviews with people who ask not to be named publicly. It is a slow, methodical accumulation of detail that builds toward a moment of clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when enough pieces align that the picture can no longer be read as coincidence. Day 79 was one of those moments of clarity. The search warrant executed on February 13, 2024 was the public face of that clarity. But the investigation did not stop when those warrants were served. It accelerated, because evidence recovered during a search creates new questions as fast as it answers old ones. And some of the new questions that emerged from that evidence pointed somewhere the original investigation had not yet looked. They pointed toward Tommaso. There is something psychologically significant about the way certain individuals respond to a high-profile disappearance that is unfolding in their geographic proximity. Most people pull away from the situation entirely. The proximity itself creates discomfort, and the natural human response is to create distance, physical, conversational, behavioral. But occasionally, investigators encounter individuals who do the opposite, who maintain an unusual awareness of the case's progress, who demonstrate a knowledge of details that should not be publicly available, who, when questioned, reveal a familiarity with specifics that cannot be explained by media coverage alone. Behavioral analysts working this case took note of that pattern in relation to Tommaso. That observation, combined with the geographic connection and the behavioral timeline, is what built the foundation. And the forensic layer, the physical evidence now being re-examined through this new lens, is what elevated that foundation into something law enforcement cannot look away from. The investigation everyone believed was moving toward a conclusion just opened a new door. And behind that door is a profile, a timeline, and a connection to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance that nobody in the public conversation had prepared for. But Tommaso's connection to this case goes deeper than anyone realized, because the evidence linking him does not just place him near the scene. It places him inside a window of time that only the real perpetrator could explain. Evidence does not lie, it waits. It sits inside sealed bags, inside controlled environments, inside databases running comparison after comparison, and it waits for investigators to ask the right question. Because the right question is everything. The same piece of evidence that means nothing inside one framework of understanding becomes definitive inside another. Physical evidence is not just what it is what it tells you when you know what to ask. And in the Nancy Guthrie investigation, investigators are now asking different questions. The black gloves recovered approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home in the Catalina foothills were always one of the most significant pieces of physical evidence in this case. Their location was deliberate. 2 miles is not a distance covered accidentally. Someone placed those gloves, or discarded them, with the specific geography of that area in mind. The distance from the home, the direction of travel, the route that someone would take if they knew the neighborhood, knew the road patterns, and knew exactly how far to move before stopping. That geographic specificity was noted early. It told investigators something important about whoever left those gloves behind, something about their knowledge of the terrain. But it was the DNA that changed everything. Not because it produced one clear profile, a single contributor that investigators could immediately cross-reference against a database and identify. It was more complicated than that. Significantly more complicated. The gloves produced mixed DNA from multiple contributors. And that distinction, mixed versus single source, shifted the entire framework of the investigation in a fundamental way. A single DNA profile points to one person acting alone. Mixed DNA points to something else entirely. It points to multiple individuals handling the same object. Multiple people connected to the same physical evidence. Multiple contributors to a scene that was supposed to leave no trace at all. The fact that the gloves carried DNA from more than one person was not a failure of the perpetrator's planning. It was a window, an unintended window into the structure of what actually happened, into the reality that this was not one person acting on impulse, but a coordinated effort involving more than one set of hands. Investigators understood this immediately. The forensic genealogy process that has become central to modern cold case and active case investigation allows analysts to work from partial or mixed DNA profiles in ways that were not possible a decade ago. It is a slow process. It requires cross-referencing genetic material against publicly available genealogy databases, building family trees from partial matches, and working methodically through branches of connection until the profile narrows to a specific individual or cluster of individuals. That process has been running in the background of this investigation since the gloves were collected. And the results of that process are now being viewed through the lens of Tommaso's connection to the case. Here is what that means in practical terms. If forensic genealogy analysis produces a profile that intersects, even partially, with Tommaso's genetic background or the genetic backgrounds of individuals connected to him, that intersection becomes evidence. Not circumstantial, not theoretical, physical, biological, documented evidence that places a specific human being in the chain of custody of those gloves. That is the kind of evidence that does not disappear under cross-examination. The white Range Rover seized from a Culver's parking lot during the February 13th search operation was the second major piece of physical evidence in this case. Vehicle seizures in disappearance investigations are significant for reasons that go beyond what is visible to the naked eye. Modern forensic analysis of a vehicle interior can recover biological material, trace fibers, digital data from internal navigation and communication systems, and GPS records that map every location the vehicle visited over an extended period. Digital records never forget. A vehicle's internal systems record movement with a precision that human memory cannot match and human planning rarely accounts for. The GPS history of that Range Rover, if recovered intact, represents a chronological map of everywhere it traveled in the weeks surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Every route, every stop, every location visited at every hour of the day or night. Investigators know exactly what was in that vehicle's memory. They have not shared it publicly. But the fact that the vehicle was seized under a coordinated federal warrant, not a routine traffic stop, not an opportunistic check, but a planned, simultaneous, multi-location operation, means that what law enforcement expected to find inside that vehicle was specific. They did not seize it on the chance that something might be there. They seized it because they had reason to believe something was. Now consider the Ring camera footage. A masked individual was captured on residential surveillance near the neighborhood, stealing potted cacti, an unusual enough behavior to draw attention, but not alarming enough in isolation to trigger immediate law enforcement escalation. At the time, it was logged as a suspicious activity report. A behavioral note, something to cross-reference if other evidence pointed in a relevant direction. That footage is now being re-examined, not because the theft of cacti is relevant to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance in isolation, but because the behavior captured on that footage, the specific route taken, the timing, the manner in which the individual moved through the neighborhood, reveals someone who was familiar with that area. Someone who knew which camera angles to avoid. Someone who moved with a confidence that spoke to prior reconnaissance. That pattern of movement, when mapped against Tommaso's documented geographic connection to the Catalina foothills, is one of the analytical threads investigators are currently working. And then there is the digital forensic layer. Phone records in a case like this are among the most revealing categories of evidence available to investigators. Not just call logs, though those matter, but location data embedded in device activity. The pings that a phone registers as it connects to different cell towers across a geographic area create a movement record that is nearly impossible to fabricate or alter retroactively. Every time a device connects to a tower, the time and location of that connection is recorded by the carrier. In the weeks surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the cell tower data for devices connected to individuals in this investigation has been carefully mapped. That mapping creates a picture of who was where, when, and whether those locations intersect with the areas and timeframes relevant to the case. Tommaso's device history is part of that mapping. Here is what makes this forensic picture significant. It is not one piece of evidence pointing in one direction. It is multiple independent categories of evidence, biological, digital, geographic, behavioral, all being analyzed simultaneously, and all producing findings that converge on the same investigative focus. That convergence is not coincidence. And here is the detail that has not been publicly explained. One piece of evidence recovered during the original February 13th search operation was deliberately withheld from the press briefings that followed. Sheriff Nanos discussed the gloves. He referenced the vehicle. He spoke in general terms about the progress of the investigation. But one specific item, recovered, documented, and preserved, was never mentioned. Not accidentally omitted, deliberately held back. Investigators hold evidence back for one of two reasons. Either they do not yet know its significance, or they know exactly what it means, and they are protecting that knowledge until the moment it can be used most effectively. Sources close to this investigation suggest the second reason applies here. And that unexplained piece of evidence, the one Sheriff Nanos never mentioned, connects directly to Tommaso. Nothing about this case happened by accident. That is the thread that runs through every layer of this investigation. Every piece of evidence, every behavioral pattern, every deliberate silence from law enforcement. Nothing about what happened to Nancy Guthrie was impulsive. Nothing was random. And nothing, not the location, not the timing, not the method, happened without someone, somewhere, making a decision that required specific knowledge. The kind of knowledge that does not come from the outside looking in. When investigators began building the picture of what happened in the Catalina foothills, one of the earliest and most persistent questions was not who, but how. How did whoever was responsible know enough about Nancy Guthrie's world to move against her in a way that left so little visible trace? How did they know her routines? Her home's layout? The blind spots in the neighborhood's surveillance coverage? How did they plan something this calculated without someone in their immediate circle knowing? Those questions do not have comfortable answers. And the answers that investigators have been assembling over the course of this investigation point toward something that is, in many ways, more disturbing than the disappearance itself. Because the emerging picture is not one of an outside actor targeting a high-profile family from a distance. It is something closer. Something more personal. Something that suggests the information used to plan this did not come from public sources. It came from somewhere inside. Consider what Tucson's geographic position represents in the broader context of federal law enforcement. The city sits approximately 60 miles from the Mexican border. That proximity has made it a consistent area of interest for federal agencies tracking cross-border organized activity for decades. The FBI's involvement in this case from the early stages was not simply a function of Nancy Guthrie's public profile. Federal jurisdiction in disappearance cases follows specific legal frameworks, but federal interest, the kind that brings resources and specialized units, follows different signals entirely. The signals in this case pointed toward the possibility of organized network involvement from early in the investigation. That theory, the ransom theory, was never officially confirmed. But it was also never officially dismissed. And the behavior of law enforcement throughout this case, the deliberate pacing, the controlled press releases, the strategic silences, is consistent with an investigation that is trying to protect operational details that could compromise a broader operation if made public prematurely. Sheriff Nanos made one decision throughout the course of this investigation that told investigators, and careful observers, everything they needed to know. He named people publicly and cleared them. He stood in front of cameras and told the public which individuals had been examined and eliminated from the investigation. He did it more than once. He did it with specificity. He never did it for Luke Daly. And he has not done it for Tommaso. That silence is not an oversight. In law enforcement communication, what a spokesperson chooses not to say is as deliberate as what they do say. A sheriff managing a high-visibility federal investigation does not omit names from his public clearances by accident. He omits them because he cannot clear them. Because the evidence does not allow it. Because clearing them publicly would be false, and in a case this significant, a false clearance is not a communication error. It is an obstruction of the investigation itself. Nanos knows this, his team knows this, and his continued silence regarding Tommaso speaks in a language that requires no translation. Now consider the question of motive. Because motive in a case like this is not simply about why someone would act against Nancy Guthrie specifically. Motive in a networked operation, if that is what this is, operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There is the immediate motive, what the individual actors expected to gain. And there is the structural motive, what the network as a whole was attempting to accomplish. The reward money offered in connection with this case is part of the motive picture in a way that rarely gets examined closely. Significant reward money in a high-profile missing persons case does two things. It incentivizes information. It creates a financial reason for people on the edges of a criminal network to break their silence. And it tells investigators something about the people who do not come forward despite knowing what happened. Because in a network where everyone is aware that a substantial reward exists, the decision to stay silent in the face of that financial incentive means that whatever holds people's silence is worth more to them than the reward. Fear is worth more than money. Loyalty, or the consequences of broken loyalty, is worth more than money. That calculus tells investigators something about the structure of the network they're dealing with. It is not casual. It is not loosely organized. The people who know what happened to Nancy Guthrie have weighed the reward against the alternative and chosen silence. That choice speaks to a level of organization and internal discipline that goes beyond opportunistic criminal behavior. And Tommaso's position within that structure, the role he is believed to have played, the access he is believed to have had, the connections he maintained that placed him at the intersection of information and action, is precisely what investigators are now mapping with the full resources of a federal investigation behind them. Here is where the picture becomes most unsettling. The planning required to make someone disappear from a quiet, residential, surveillance-present neighborhood without triggering an immediate alert requires inside knowledge. Not general knowledge about the area. Specific knowledge. The kind that comes from someone who has been told things. Who has been trusted with information about routines, schedules, points of access, information that exists only inside a person's immediate circle. Investigators have been examining the question of whether someone connected to Nancy Guthrie's trusted world, not on the outer edges, but genuinely close, may have provided information that should never have left that circle. Not out of malice, necessarily. Information moves in ways that the person sharing it does not always fully understand. A casual conversation, an innocent disclosure, a detail shared with someone who seemed safe, who presented themselves as safe, but who was carrying that information somewhere far more dangerous. That possibility, the betrayal that comes not from an enemy but from inside a circle of trust, is the thread investigators are pulling on right now. And it is the thread that connects most directly to Tommaso's profile, his access, and his proximity to the information architecture of this case. The most chilling detail is not that Tommaso has been linked to the disappearance. It is that, according to sources close to the investigation, someone inside Nancy's trusted circle may have provided him with information he should never have had access to. The betrayal did not come from outside. It came from within. Some cases close quickly. Evidence accumulates, a suspect is identified, charges are filed, and the machinery of the justice system moves forward in the way the public expects it to. Those cases are straightforward, not because the crime was simple, but because the evidence is clear enough to carry a prosecution from arrest to conviction without collapsing under the weight of complexity. The Nancy Guthrie case is not that kind of case. It never was. From the first days of the investigation, the people working this case understood that they were dealing with something layered. Something that required patience as much as urgency. Something that would not resolve on the timeline that public attention demands, because rushing toward a premature resolution in a case this complex does not bring justice. It creates gaps that defense attorneys can walk through, and gaps that let guilty people walk free. So investigators have moved carefully. 79 days before the first major public development. Weeks more since that breakthrough. And now, Tommaso's name emerging as an active investigative focus, shifting the entire landscape of the case once again. Where does the investigation stand today? Sheriff Chris Nanos has maintained the same disciplined approach to public communication that has defined this case from the beginning. Specific, measured, deliberate in what it reveals and what it withholds. Following the February 13th search warrant execution, Nanos confirmed that evidence had been collected and that the investigation was progressing. He spoke about the process. He spoke about the commitment of his department and the federal partners working alongside them. He did not name Tommaso. He did not discuss the specific forensic developments that have now brought this name into active focus. That restraint is not evasion. It is strategy. In a case with federal dimensions, one that potentially touches organized network activity and cross-border considerations, public statements are not just communication. They are operational decisions. Every detail released publicly is a detail that reaches the people law enforcement is investigating. Every name spoken in a press conference is a name that gets a phone call within the hour. Investigators manage information because information management is part of the investigation itself. Nanos understands this. His silence on Tommaso is the same silence he maintained on Luke Daly until the moment the search warrants were ready to execute. It is the silence of someone who is building toward something, not the silence of someone with nothing to say. For Savannah Guthrie, this investigation carries a dimension that no professional platform and no television audience can fully absorb. She is a journalist by training and by instinct. She understands how cases like this work. She understands the deliberate pace of a complex federal investigation, the strategic silences, the careful management of public information. She understands it intellectually, but Nancy Guthrie is her mother. And every day that passes without resolution is a day lived inside a particular kind of uncertainty that no amount of professional understanding makes easier to carry. The Guthrie family has remained publicly composed throughout this investigation, dignified in a way that speaks to something deep in their character. But composure is not the same as peace. And the emergence of Tommaso's name as a new active focus does not bring peace. It reopens a wound that was never fully closed and asks the family to absorb yet another layer of a story that was already almost too heavy to hold. Now consider what Tommaso's emergence means for the case's overall trajectory. It does not narrow the investigation. It expands it. Because if Tommaso was connected to what happened to Nancy Guthrie, and if his connection runs through the network of individuals that investigators have been mapping since the beginning of this case, then the full scope of that network is still being defined. Which means the investigation is not approaching its final chapter. It is approaching the point where its full shape finally becomes visible, where the outline of everything that has been built in the dark over months of methodical work begins to emerge into the light. That is a significant moment in any investigation. But it is also the most dangerous moment. Because it is the moment when the people who are being investigated understand, for the first time, that the net is real. That it is closing. That the silence they have maintained, the silence bought by fear or loyalty or the calculation that the reward was not worth the risk, may no longer be enough to keep them safe. Desperate calculation leads to desperate action. Investigators know this. It is why the pace of this case has shifted. Why the coordination between local and federal resources has intensified. Why certain aspects of the investigation that were previously moving at a methodical pace are now moving with more urgency. The pressure is real, and it is increasing. Here is what remains unanswered. The question that now sits at the center of everything this investigation is working toward. It is not simply who did this. Law enforcement is closing in on that answer with tools and evidence that were not available at the beginning of this case. The question that remains, the one that will define not just the resolution of this case but the full accounting of what happened to Nancy Guthrie, is why. Not the surface why, not the transactional explanation of what someone expected to gain. The deeper why. The why that explains how someone gained access to the information necessary to plan this. The why that explains who made the decisions, who carried them out, and who stood in the middle with knowledge of both. That is the question investigators are building toward. And Tommaso's place in that question, the specific role he played, the specific knowledge he carried, the specific connections he maintained, is what the next phase of this investigation will determine. Nancy Guthrie is still gone. Her family is still waiting. The investigation is still moving, more focused now, more informed, carrying the weight of months of forensic and intelligence work that has brought it to this moment. The people who know what happened to her are not as protected as they once believed. Investigators are not closing in on a suspect. They are closing in on a story, one far darker, far more calculated, and far more personal than anyone imagined. And when that story finally becomes fully visible, it will not leave room for doubt. The truth in this case has been buried, but it has been bleeding through the surface for months. And the blood trail leads somewhere specific. It leads to answers the public has not yet been allowed to hear. But they are coming. In the next video, the detail that changes everything. A specific connection that investigators have been protecting for months has just moved closer to the surface. One relationship, one disclosure, one piece of the network that links Tommaso not just to the geography of this case, but to Nancy Guthrie herself, in a way that nobody in this investigation anticipated. If you walk away now, that is the piece you will miss. And in a case that has already rewritten itself once, that piece is the one that rewrites it again. Stay close, because this story is not finished.